All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at spiritual warfare, masculine enlightenment in a broken world.
Oh, yeah. This one is dense,
It is. It really is.
but I think it's going to speak directly to what a lot of our listeners are thinking about.
Definitely. Especially if you're interested in the history of institutions, things like feminism and Marxism,
The red pill philosophy, of course.
and how to figure out your own covert contracts.
Which, let's be honest, that's a big one.
Huge. And this book goes there, but in a way I haven't really seen before. It's all about finding spiritual enlightenment, but for men, in a world that often feels stacked against them.
That's a really good way to put it.
So where do we even start with a book like this? It covers so much ground.
Well, right out of the gate, the author uses Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a jumping off point.
Yeah, but he doesn't stay there long before it gets...
Really interesting, right?
Exactly. Because he connects those basic needs like safety, belonging, esteem to stages of spiritual enlightenment. It's not your typical self-help stuff.
It's not about like, oh, you need to have $1 million in the bank before you can start meditating. It's really not that at all.
Yeah, it's more about understanding how our basic needs, those like fundamental things we all crave,
Right.
actually impact our spiritual growth.
Like if you're constantly worried about making ends meet or if you feel like you don't belong anywhere, it's going to be a lot harder to focus on like higher spiritual pursuits.
You're fighting an uphill battle constantly.
Exactly. He actually argues that not meeting those needs can actually hinder your spiritual development. He uses the example of a man who's trapped in a job he hates, a dead-end job.
Ugh, been there.
Right. He's like, that lack of esteem, that lack of purpose, it directly impacts his ability to even connect with his spiritual side.
Which makes total sense. It's like when you're feeling stuck and unfulfilled, pondering the meaning of life is probably the last thing on your mind.
Exactly. You're just trying to survive.
But then how does he connect at the higher levels of the pyramid, like self-actualization, to spiritual growth? Because that's where it gets kind of mind-blowing.
It does. He sees that self-actualization, realizing your full potential as a human being,
Right.
as being deeply intertwined with reaching enlightenment. And he brings up some interesting figures, like Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL, as examples of men who embody this.
Disciplined, driven.
Yeah, they've mastered discipline and purpose, and that fuels their spiritual journeys.
So it's not one before the other. They kind of go hand in hand.
Exactly. And that's a really key point.
So it's like building that solid foundation in your life.
Yeah.
Your career, relationship, sense of self actually allows you to reach for those greater spiritual heights.
I think that's a fantastic way to put it.
Not neglecting the practical stuff, but mastering it in a way that fuels your spiritual growth.
He definitely emphasizes that, not neglecting those worldly aspects.
Now, the book also digs into Erikson's stages of psychosocial development.
Yeah.
What was it about those that really stood out to you in terms of spiritual enlightenment?
Well, remember, Erikson focuses on these crises we all face at different points in our lives.
Right.
Like that classic identity versus role confusion that teenagers go through.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Right. But he ties these stages to spiritual development in a clever way.
Okay, how so?
He argues that successfully navigating those crises helps men build a really strong sense of self.
Which is crucial for their spiritual journey.
So crucial, absolutely.
So each stage is like a stepping stone, right?
Yeah, building on the last, creating this foundation to explore spirituality.
He even uses an example of a guy named John, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah. John, he was stuck in that stagnation stage that Erikson talks about, you know?
A midlife crisis kind of thing?
Yeah, feeling lost, purposeless. But get this, he joined a spiritual community
Okay.
and started meditating, and through that, he worked through those feelings
Wow.
and found a renewed sense of purpose. That then helped him on his spiritual path.
So resolving those internal struggles, those crises, actually clear the way for a deeper spiritual growth.
It's like clearing the path, exactly. He argues that if we don't address those underlying psychological issues, they can become roadblocks on our spiritual journey.
Roadblocks, yeah, makes sense.
And then the book really takes a turn, goes deep into Carl Jung's ideas about individuation and the shadow self.
Oh yeah, Jung. This is where it gets intense.
It does, but it's also where it starts to connect to those covert contracts you mentioned earlier.
Because it can feel a little intimidating at first, all that shadow self stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think this is where the rubber meets the road for a lot of us.
I agree, because remember, Jung saw individuation as becoming a complete, integrated individual.
Like becoming whole.
Yes. And a huge part of that is confronting and integrating your shadow self.
What you think?
Those parts of yourself that you try to hide or deny.
Like our flaws, the things we're ashamed of.
Exactly. The author suggests that failing to acknowledge and integrate our shadow selves, that's what can actually lead to those covert contracts.
Oh, interesting.
We end up living out those repressed aspects unconsciously, and often it sabotages our relationships, our growth.
So we're not even aware it's happening.
Not at all. It's like this hidden program running in the background.
So by confronting our shadow selves, we can break free from those destructive patterns and create better relationships.
That's the idea. He even gives some strategies, things like journaling, meditation, even therapy.
To bring those hidden parts to light.
To understand ourselves fully.
And use that awareness to create positive change.
Right. It's all about understanding.
So we've covered Maslow, Erikson, and Jung, a lot of psychology. But you mentioned something earlier that I want to touch on. You're also interested in the historical forces that shape our institutions.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. That's a huge part of the puzzle.
Particularly the influence of cultural Marxism and feminism,
Mm-hmm.
which I know is something that resonates with a lot of our listeners.
And the author tackles these head on.
He does. He doesn't shy away from it at all.
He sees cultural Marxism as a major force that's eroded traditional values, and he even says weakened men.
And he traces it back to the Frankfurt School.
Right? You got it. That group of intellectuals who were critical of capitalism.
Challenging those traditional power structures.
Exactly. He argues that their ideas have seeped into everything. Media, education, even the workplace.
And he sees that as impacting men's sense of self and their place in the world.
Directly, he says cultural Marxism has created this climate where men are demonized or marginalized, making it harder to find their purpose.
And harder to achieve that spiritual enlightenment we've been talking about.
Exactly. It's like another layer of challenge on top of everything else.
Okay, so he's painting a pretty stark picture of the challenges men face today.
He is, but he doesn't stop there.
Because he wouldn't be much help if he just left us with a bunch of problems and no solutions.
Right. He offers a way forward. He urges men to become aware of these forces and to resist them.
Which sounds like it ties into his concept of spiritual warfare, which we'll have to explore more later.
Oh, we'll definitely be getting into that. He sees it as a battle for the hearts and minds of men.
Intense stuff.
A battle against these forces that are trying to undermine their spiritual potential.
It's a powerful message, and I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners.
I think so. It's a message a lot of men are hungry to hear.
Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to those covert contracts, since that's something you specifically brought up.
Yeah, let's unpack that a bit more.
And this is where those insights into Jungian psychology get really, really relevant.
They do.
Yeah.
Because remember, he argues that those covert contracts are often rooted in our shadow selves, those parts we've repressed or denied.
So if we haven't fully integrated our shadow selves, we might end up acting out those repressed desires or fears in our relationships.
That's exactly it. He gives an example of a man who's unconsciously drawn to emotionally unavailable women.
Okay, I've seen that pattern before.
Because he's repressed his own need for intimacy.
Interesting. He's pushing it away.
So he might enter into a relationship with this unspoken agreement, this covert contract, that he'll provide financial security, but in exchange for emotional distance.
Oh, that's not a recipe for a healthy, happy relationship.
Not at all. It's a recipe for disaster, long term.
So how do we break free from these covert contracts? What does he suggest?
He stresses self-awareness, becoming conscious of those hidden patterns and motivations.
Becoming aware of what's driving our behavior.
Exactly. He offers tools like journaling, that shadow work we talked about.
To uncover those unconscious beliefs and desires, shining a light on those dark corners.
You got it. And then making conscious choices about how we want to show up in our relationships.
Setting boundaries.
Communicating our needs clearly and assertively.
This is already giving me a lot to think about. Before we jump into the next section, which is all about religion and symbolism.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Is there anything else about these covert contracts you think is super important for our listener to understand?
He brings up a crucial point about understanding the societal forces that have shaped these contracts in the first place.
Like it's not just happening in a vacuum. It's influenced by history and culture.
Exactly. He argues that men are often conditioned to play certain roles.
Provider, protector, the strong, silent type.
Right, all that. Which can lead to them suppressing their emotional needs and then, bam, enter those lopsided agreements.
So it's not just individual psychology, it's also about understanding that bigger picture.
Exactly. Understanding the context, questioning those societal expectations.
That's a really empowering message. Taking back control and creating relationships based on authenticity and respect.
It really is. It's about rewriting the script. Absolutely rewriting the script. And that leads perfectly into the next big topic, the role of religion and symbolism in a man's life.
You know, I have to admit, when I saw that in the book, I was a little skeptical. I'm not a very religious person myself,
Yeah.
so I wasn't sure how much it would resonate with me or with our listeners.
Yeah, I can see that, especially for guys who've really embraced that red pill philosophy. It can be complicated.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what I found fascinating was how he presented religion not as like dogma or rules,
Right.
but as this psychological and spiritual framework.
Yeah, he acknowledges both the benefits and challenges of organized religion. He emphasizes finding your own path, but also that structured guidance can be helpful for some people.
And he even uses an example of a young man who was struggling with addiction.
Oh, yeah. What was his story?
He found solace in a Buddhist monastery of all places.
Interesting.
It wasn't about the beliefs. It was about the discipline and the community.
The structure.
Yeah. And that really helped him turn his life around.
So it's more about that sense of belonging and purpose that can come from being part of something larger than yourself.
Exactly. And it made me think about how a lot of men today are searching for that same thing,
Oh, yeah.
but they might not find it in those traditional religious settings.
He touches on that, suggesting that men might need to look beyond traditional forms of religion to find what truly speaks to them.
To find their own path.
Exactly, their own unique path.
Okay, so we've got this idea of religion as a framework, but what about symbolism? That whole section felt a little out there to me.
I can see how it might seem that way at first, but remember, he's pulling from Jungian psychology again.
Ah, Jung, always coming back to Jung.
Always. He suggests that symbols are more than just images. They tap into our subconscious minds.
Powerful stuff.
Very powerful. And he specifically links this back to men's spiritual development.
How so?
He argues that understanding these symbols and archetypes can help men connect with their deeper selves
Okay.
and find that sense of meaning and purpose that they might be missing.
It's like unlocking a hidden language.
Exactly, a language that speaks to our souls.
And he gives some really interesting examples like the hero's journey,
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
which pops up in myths and stories all over the world.
Across cultures.
Yeah, and he suggests that this archetype can be a powerful guide for men who are on their own spiritual journey.
Facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, ultimately achieving a transformation.
It's a story we're all drawn to.
It's ingrained in us.
And it made me think about those covert contracts in terms of symbolism, too.
Yeah.
Like maybe they represent a kind of shadow archetype that we need to confront.
Whoa, that's a really interesting thought. It makes you think about how those patterns might be playing out on a deeper level.
Yeah, a symbolic level.
Exactly. It's like these symbols are everywhere once you start to look for them.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the author also talks about synchronicity. Those meaningful coincidences that can feel like signs from the universe.
Yeah. Have you ever experienced anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think we all have those moments where it feels like something bigger is at play.
Like the universe is trying to tell you something.
Exactly. I remember one time I was feeling really lost about my career.
Oh, yeah.
I was actually thinking about quitting my job.
Wow, big decision.
It was, and that same day I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years. And it turned out he was working in a field I was really interested in.
No way.
We had a long conversation, and by the end of it, I felt like I had a whole new direction.
It's amazing how those synchronicities can show up at just the right time.
It's like a signpost pointing you in the right direction.
Exactly. And the author suggests that these synchronicities aren't just random events.
He thinks they're meaningful signs that can guide us on our path.
He encourages readers to start paying attention to them, to see them as messages from the universe.
To be open to the possibility.
Exactly. And to maybe even keep a journal to track them and reflect on their significance.
That's a great idea. It could help us to become more aware of those subtle nudges from the universe.
And maybe even decode what they're trying to tell us.
Now, I know our listeners are particularly interested in understanding the history of institutions and how they've been shaped by forces like feminism and Marxism.
Right, right. And the author definitely doesn't shy away from those topics.
Doesn't he? Dives right in. He argues that cultural Marxism in particular has had a profound impact on our institutions.
Leading to a decline in traditional values and a weakening of masculinity.
And he traces the origins of cultural Marxism back to the Frankfurt School, suggesting that their ideas about critiquing power structures have spread throughout our culture.
Through academia, media, popular culture.
Yeah, it's like their critique has become the dominant narrative,
And he sees feminism as being intertwined with this cultural shift.
arguing that it has contributed to a demonization of masculinity and an erosion of traditional gender roles.
He offers a lot of examples of how he sees this playing out in society, from the education system to the legal system to even the entertainment industry.
That's a pretty comprehensive critique,
It is, and he suggests that this cultural shift has had a real impact on men.
leading to a crisis of masculinity and a loss of purpose,
He argues that men are being told that their traditional roles are no longer valued.
that they need to adapt to a new, more feminized world.
But he also offers a message of hope.
He does.
Yeah, he suggests that men can reclaim their masculinity and their spiritual potential by becoming aware of these forces
By understanding the game.
and actively resisting them.
So it's not about giving up or accepting defeat.
Not at all. It's about fighting back.
Finding strength in those traditional masculine virtues.
Courage, discipline, a sense of purpose.
The things we talked about earlier.
Exactly, those timeless qualities that are still relevant today.
And he also emphasizes the importance of finding community with other like-minded men.
Yeah, he believes that men need to support each other, encourage each other, and hold each other accountable.
It's like building a brotherhood.
A brotherhood of spiritual warriors.
I like that, a brotherhood of spiritual warriors. Now, I want to dive into a concept that he keeps coming back to throughout the book, this idea of spiritual warfare. What exactly does he mean by that?
He's essentially arguing that there are forces in the world that are actively working to undermine our spiritual growth.
So like evil spirits or demonic influences.
He doesn't use those terms specifically, but he definitely suggests that there are negative energies at play.
Energies that can sabotage our spiritual progress.
Exactly, and he sees cultural Marxism and feminism as being part of this spiritual warfare.
Okay, so he's not just talking about personal challenges or inner demons. He sees these larger societal forces as being part of the battle.
He does, and it's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but he also offers some hope, right?
He does. He believes that we can fight back against these forces and ultimately triumph.
But how? What kind of strategies does he suggest?
He emphasizes the importance of strengthening our spiritual defenses, which he compares to putting on armor.
So like engaging in practices like prayer, meditation, studying spiritual teachings.
Exactly. Those are all part of building that spiritual resilience.
And he also talks about the importance of being vigilant against negative influences, which he compares to guarding our hearts and minds.
So being mindful of the media we consume, the people we spend time with, the thoughts we allow ourselves to dwell on.
It's like being aware of the battlefield.
Exactly. Knowing where the enemy is coming from.
And then he talks about the importance of using our spiritual weapons, which he compares to swords and shields.
This is where it gets interesting. What are those spiritual weapons?
He mentions things like faith, truth, love, forgiveness.
Qualities that can be used to fight against evil.
He believes, so he thinks they have the power to overcome darkness and bring light into the world. So it's not about physical combat. It's about using these spiritual tools to protect ourselves and to make a positive impact.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that this is a battle that we can win, but it requires courage, discipline, and a strong connection to our spiritual source.
It's not for the faint of heart.
It's not, but he also offers encouragement and reassurance.
Reminding readers that they're not alone in this battle.
Exactly, that there's a whole community of spiritual warriors out there fighting alongside them.
That's a comforting thought. That we're all in this together.
We are, and that ultimately good will triumph over evil.
That's a message of hope that we can all cling to in these challenging times.
We are, and that's a powerful message to hold on to. And building on this idea of spiritual warfare, the author introduces a concept that might be familiar to you, the red pill.
Oh yeah, that's a big one in certain circles. It's all about waking up to a deeper reality, right?
Oh.
Like seeing the world as it truly is.
Exactly. And he connects it to that choice we all have to see the world as it truly is, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges those mainstream narratives.
And he specifically applies this to men's spiritual journeys, right?
Absolutely. He argues that becoming red-pilled helps men see through what he calls the illusions around masculinity in modern culture. Like a lot of the messages men receive about how they should behave, think, feel, he says those messages are actually disempowering.
So it's like taking off a pair of glasses that have been distorting your vision.
Yeah. And seeing clearly for the first time, he encourages men to question those narratives and to rediscover those traditional masculine virtues.
Courage, strength, discipline, purpose, all those things we talked about earlier.
Exactly. He argues that these qualities have been kind of suppressed or even demonized in modern culture, but they're actually vital for men to thrive.
Not just in the world, but also on their spiritual paths.
Exactly. It's all connected.
And he ties this back to those historical forces we discussed, arguing that Cultural Marxism and feminism have played a role in this shift away from traditional masculinity.
He does, but he doesn't present it as a hopeless situation.
There's a way back.
There is. He sees the red pill as a wake-up call, a catalyst for men to reclaim their power and find their own unique path to enlightenment.
So taking the red pill is just the first step.
It's the beginning of the journey.
What else does he suggest men do to actually embark on this path of masculine enlightenment?
He offers a whole toolkit of practical strategies, and a lot of them echo the themes we've already talked about. He emphasizes physical health, reminding readers that a strong body supports a strong spirit.
Makes sense. You can't fight any battle if you're exhausted and run down.
Exactly. He even offers tips for incorporating exercise, a healthy diet, and rest into our busy lives.
Because let's be honest, finding time for all that can be tough.
It can be. But he stresses that it's essential. And he also dives deeper into those mindfulness practices.
Meditation, spending time in nature.
Those are great ones. Anything that helps you quiet the mind and become more present.
Because that's where the real work begins, right?
It is. He also encourages journaling and self-reflection, really getting to know yourself on a deep level.
Understanding your motivations, your desires, your shadow self.
All of it. And he reminds us that by doing that inner work, we can break free from those covert contracts.
And create more fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. It's all about taking responsibility for ourselves and our choices.
So much of this comes back to awareness, doesn't it?
It does. Awareness is key. And finally, he circles back to that idea of embracing the role of the spiritual warrior.
This is where it all comes together.
It is. He stresses that it's not about physical aggression, it's about cultivating those inner qualities.
Courage, discipline, purpose.
Exactly. And being willing to stand up for what you believe in, to fight for your own spiritual growth, and to make a positive impact on the world.
That's a powerful vision. And it's inspiring to think that we can all tap into that inner warrior.
We can. It's in all of us.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of spiritual warfare, masculine enlightenment in a broken world.
There's so much to unpack in this book. It's a real treasure trove of wisdom.
It is. And I hope our listener feels empowered to explore these concepts further and to apply them in their own life.
Me too, because remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding these dynamics, men can start to reclaim their agency and create a more fulfilling future for themselves and for generations to come.
Beautifully said. So to our listener, if this deep dive resonated with you, we encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and continue exploring these ideas.
Yeah.
And as you continue on your journey, remember this. You have the power to become the best version of yourself, a true spiritual warrior in a world that needs your strength, your courage, and your light.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep fighting the good fight.